Welcome to the Relit Practice, the podcast for therapists, burnout recovery, and sustainable career support for psychologists, social workers, therapists, and other mental health professionals working across public health, community agencies, and private practice. My name is Stacey Steele, and I'm a registered psychologist in Alberta, Canada, and an EMDR consultant. Here we talk honestly about burnout, moral injury, trauma work, and the systemic realities of helping professions, while we build practices and lives that are sustainable, ethical, and fulfilling. Last week, we actually went after the big guns. The idea that if you've done all the right things and you're still depleted, the problem is not you. It's the framework that you're working in. If you missed it, go back to episode number 5 because it sets the stage for everything that we're doing now. This week, I want to go after another popular piece of advice in our profession. You just need better boundaries. I want to be crystal clear from the start. I am not anti-boundary. Boundaries matter tremendously. I've done years of work on building my own boundaries, and it is a genuine nervous system skill that we all need and an essential part of clinical practice and life. But I think the way that we talk about boundaries in the helping professions has become a problem in itself, and also a way that systems may gaslight us into thinking that the problem is us and takes away accountability. So I think for many clinicians, especially those with that self-sacrifice, unrelenting standards, schemas that I mentioned before, being told to set better boundaries is not just unhelpful, it actually can be harmful. So hear me out on this. When a clinician says, I am overwhelmed, the first thing that they hear from supervisors, colleagues, even from Instagram, is some version of, have you tried setting better boundaries? On the surface, this makes sense. We actually teach that to our clients. We do our best to practice it. There's amazing books out there written about boundaries. Every clinician does need them. But here's the problem. When you have a 60 client caseload, unpaid admin, and a broken referral pipeline that are actually the sources of your depletion, holding firmer boundaries is just a more sophisticated way of telling you that the system's failure to protect you is your personal problem to manage. If the problem were just about boundaries, when you implemented them and set healthy boundaries and sustainable boundaries, the problem will go away. But we know that sometimes is not true and often isn't the case. It can be the clinical profession's version of telling somebody with a structural workplace issue to just have a difficult conversation with your manager. They'll understand. We know that isn't always possible. It can sound really empowering. It gives us something to do about it. But it also locates the fix as being within the individual and leaving the rest of the structure completely intact. The research is relevant here is that when workplace is the driver, the intervention is not holding a better boundary or having a different workload. When fairness is the driver, it's not about your ability to say no to the system. It's about the system unevenly distributing the workload and then making you absorb it. So that is the boundary myth. The idea that if you were just better at protecting yourself or advocating for yourself, the system would not be able to hurt you. I think it functions, again, as a kind of professional gaslighting because it implies that you are the problem and that problem is permeable, not the demands. So it's almost like in relationships where we might ask a partner for what we want, or might have a boundary with a friend. And, if it only worked in the textbook way, or that whole let them theory, I just have to do that, let them and then let me. But it doesn't work like that when your livelihood is on the line. This is where the research is relevant. When workload is the driver, as it often is, the intervention isn't to have a better boundary, it's to have a different workload. When fairness is the driver, it's not about your ability to say no, it's about a system that distributes load unevenly, then praises you for absorbing it. We've all been in workplaces where there's a person that might stay late or who is the one to take on all the extra work, or maybe a group of people or a team. And that team is often held up, or that individual is held up as a star employee, or look at them, like they're for the business or they're for the agency. And don't get me started on this because it really creates so much harm in our profession, not just for the person absorbing the load, but for everyone else around them. So this is where the boundary myth comes in. It is the myth that if we just protected ourselves better, if we could advocate more effectively, the system wouldn't be able to hurt us. And we know that isn't really true. And it's almost like a professional gaslighting, because the implication is that the problem is your permeable boundaries and not the demands that are made of you. So boundaries without structural change can be containment, but it doesn't really provide lasting change. So I am going to bring in a little bit about the individual here. And as I mentioned before in the last podcast about schemas, I do want to discuss the internal systems that is almost like pouring gas on the fire of this. And it can be really, really personal. For clinicians with a self-sacrifice schema, Jeffrey Young and his colleagues identified this as one of the most common schemas in helping professionals. Being told to set better boundaries doesn't land as helpful advice. It becomes another performance demand. So let me walk you through the experience. And I know I resonate with this. This may feel familiar to you too. So internally, somebody with a self-sacrifice schema may hear that and think, I know I should set better boundaries. I know I shouldn't check emails at 10 p.m. I know I should end sessions on time, but I can't. I can't because something in me says that if I stop giving, something awful will happen and that I'll be abandoned, that I'm selfish, that the person in front of me will fall apart and it will be my fault. That is not a boundary skill deficit. That is a schema activation. And what the self-sacrifice schema does beautifully, silently, and actually very destructively is make you believe that your needs are genuinely less important than everybody else's. So not intellectually, because you know better intellectually, but somatically in your body, in the way your stomach might just drop when you think about saying no, or the way your heartbeat starts to raise when you think about a difficult conversation, or that guilt, like that almost like heaviness when you hear things like more self-care, better boundaries, and the shoulds start happening. So when somebody tells a clinician with a self-sacrifice schema to set better boundaries, this is what actually happens internally. I should be able to do this. Other people can do this. What is wrong with me that I can't? That boundary advice, instead of becoming something empowering, it becomes another source of shame and more evidence that they have failed. And it is such a double-edged sword, because the same relational patterns that does make somebody attuned and gifted in the clinical sense are the ones that make boundaries feel like you're abandoning other people, the organization, your clients. And that's what we call the caring self. The caring self is both a gift and a vulnerability. And it is really our instrument in this work of what we do in order to create empathic attunement with a client. It's what we do in order to really track what's happening in the session. And that caring self, when it collides with the self-sacrifice schema, does become weaponized inside of us. When we add another schema, unrelenting standards, which many clinicians also carry, you might get this internalized message. I should set perfect boundaries perfectly, every time perfectly, and I should do it perfectly without anyone noticing or being affected, because that would be perfect. That's not a sustainable model. That's schema interaction wearing a professional hat. And self-sacrifice and unrelenting standards are the two schemas most often reinforced in the workplace. Then what is the alternative? If boundaries alone won't fix it, and the boundary conversation often makes it worse, what can we actually do? So I think there's two ways of looking at this. And the first is structural. That might mean looking at your practice, your workplace, the conditions that you're working in, and asking yourself, what would need to change so I don't need to be a boundary setting hero and I can actually be effective in my work? That could be a caseload cap, protected admin time, maybe even a protocol to refer out so you stop absorbing cases beyond your scope. Could be renegotiating your contract or building your practice around 22 sessions a week instead of 30. So those aren't necessarily boundary decisions, they're architecture decisions. So what is the architecture of your practice? They're different because they change the conditions rather than asking you to manage the conditions better. The second way of looking at it is from a schema perspective. This is more personal, individualized work. It is getting curious about why boundaries feel dangerous. Not just knowing that you should have them, but understanding the relational blueprint underneath. For example, if your self-sacrifice schema was installed in childhood and you learned early that your value came from what you gave, not for who you were, then boundary setting isn't really a skill problem, it's a safety problem. Your nervous system believes that saying no is dangerous and that thinking of yourself makes you a bad person. That does require a different kind of support, not a boundaries workshop or an Instagram infographic, something more like what schema therapy calls empathic confrontation with yourself. By telling yourself, I understand why this pattern developed. I can see that it protected me then, and I can see it no longer serves me now, even though I still feel it is necessary. That is no quick fix, but it is a step in the right direction because it addresses the mechanism, not just the symptoms. And addressing this in unrelenting standards when the internal script may be, I am only as worthy as what I achieve, and I have to be perfect. And if I'm not perfect, I won't be accepted. So that requires that inner work, that personal reflection of what happened to me that I am scared or I'm anxious or I feel like I have to hold myself so tight and so high on a pedestal that I abandon everything else. And I do want you to remember, friends, that schemas aren't necessarily, we're not in them 24 hours a day. It's in the environments that activate them. Some of the environments that activate the schemas also reward the schemas. So it makes it more likely that we're going to continue them in a workplace that does that. Here's my invitation for you this week. Notice where boundary advice has been substituting for structural change in your life. Notice where the phrase, I should have said no, becomes another way of blaming yourself for a system that asks too much. And if you've moved out of a system and into private practice, I invite you to notice, where are you recreating those systems when you actually have more control over how you practice? Notice, where are you recreating the systemic harm that you experience at another workplace? And how are those schemas activated? If you want to explore this with other clinicians and helpers who get it, who understand that just setting better boundaries is sometimes the wrong and the least helpful advice you can hear, the next Reset Circle is April 14th, and our theme is being good enough. I chose that theme because the unrelenting standard schema that makes boundaries feel like they need to be perfect is the same one that keeps us performing through depletion, exhaustion, and burnout. Being good enough is a radical act when you're in systems that reward you for feeling not good enough and performing even harder. If something landed for you today, I'd love for you to stay connected. The Reset Circle is a free monthly gathering for helping professionals who are done pretending that they're fine and ready to tend to what this work asks for them. It's not a workshop, it's not consultation or supervision, it's a grounded, peer-level space to pause, reflect, and remember that we are not supposed to do this alone. You can go to the show notes to register. And if you're at a point where you know that a monthly 1-hour gathering just might not be enough, and you need real, sustained support in how you practice and how you resource yourself, the Relit Practice Program is built just for that. It's for mid-career clinicians who are ready to stop managing burnout, start building a practice that doesn't require you to abandon yourself to sustain yourself. If you want more information on that, you can email me at info@relitpractice.com or even join the newsletter to keep the conversation going between episodes. The newsletter is where I share research that I've been sitting with that helps us reframe some of the things going on in our own practice. And my hope is that it's the kind of honest conversation that we don't always see in our field. And there's a link to subscribe in the show notes below. If you do register for the Reset Circle, it gives you access to the replay if you can't make it, a subscription to the newsletter, a free reset checklist, which helps you look a little bit closer at your practice and maybe find areas that need some tending to. You will also get first notice when the Relit Practice Program opens up, along with early bonuses. This episode was useful. Share it with a colleague who needs to hear it. And I invite you to pause, take a moment before going into the next part of your day. My name is Stacey Steele. Take good care.